My wife said, "You'll never be more than a paycheck." The next morning, I cancelled every card in her name. I am a 32-year-old man, and the night my wife told me I would never be more than a paycheck, I felt something unclasp inside my chest. Not a dramatic snap. A quiet, deliberate release, like a lock that had been turned for months and finally lined up. I did not argue. I did not ask her to explain the sentence she had practiced. I washed the pan, dried it, and stacked it back where it belonged. Then I stood at the sink with my hands on the edge and let the words sit in the room until they stopped pretending to be a joke. We had been married 4 years. We started with modest promises and an even more modest apartment. She admired my steadiness, or said she did. I admired her speed. She liked to throw ideas into a week and see what would stick. I liked to build rails so weeks could carry weight. At first, our differences felt like teamwork. I handled the bills and the emergency fund. She handled the calendar and the social life. We both believed we were helping the other live a fuller version of themselves. And maybe we were, until admiration turned into evaluation, and evaluation turned into contempt without either of us naming the shift. Money became the stage. It often does. I worked in operations and kept a spreadsheet in my head even when I promised to switch off at dinner. She worked in marketing, a field that could crown you on Monday and ghost you by Friday. When she had a good month, we ate in a place with cloth napkins. When she had a bad one, we pretended it was an experiment in minimalism. I never held her swings against her. Life is lumpy. I kept our basics boring on purpose: rent, utilities, groceries, a cushion that grew slower than either of us wanted and faster than most people get to keep. I thought safety would be enough to make love breathe easier. I did not know how loudly some people need applause just to feel the room. The sentence about being a paycheck was not born in one argument. It grew out of a string of small humiliations that arrived dressed as honesty. She began to narrate my habits to friends like I was a character in a sitcom: the color-coded budget, the cash envelope for gifts, the "no, thanks" I had learned to say to impulse subscriptions. People laughed because the timing was good. I laughed too, at first, because I wanted to be fair. Then I noticed how my body braced before every social evening, waiting to see which ordinary part of me would be turned into content. She asked for a second card on my travel rewards account, 4 points, she said, so we could build toward a trip we would take when life was less busy. I made her an authorized user because we were married and trust felt like a muscle we couldn't allow to atrophy. The charges stayed reasonable at first. Then a boutique started appearing, a salon with rates that lived in another neighborhood, a handful of team dinners, with colleagues who somehow never brought their wallets. When I asked about them, she said I was policing her life. I reminded her we had agreed on limits. She said limits were for people who planned to stay small. She began referring to my savings as "your pile," and to anything she wanted as "our dream." I tried to differentiate between being generous and being reckless. She tried to make no such distinction at all. I paid off a small student loan and told her I felt light for the first time in years. She said she was happy for me and added that she would be happier when I learned to spend without guilt. I did not tell her that guilt and caution are different species. I was still learning how to name my own boundaries without feeling like a villain. The night of the sentence, we had just returned from a dinner that was not in the budget. Someone from her office was moving on to an agency with a bigger client list, and the bill had arrived like a dare. She signed without looking. On the way home she criticized my silence. She said I made people uncomfortable by counting decimals with my eyes. I said I was doing math because I enjoy sleeping. She said sleep was for the average. I said average is where most people survive. She looked at me like I had confessed a crime and laid it out: would never be more than a paycheck. She said she had married me for security and found herself suffocating in spreadsheets. She suggested I return to my books and leave her to build a real life. I put the receipts from my pocket on the table and arranged them by size. It was something to do with my hands while my heart took inventory. Later that night, when she slept like people sleep after a performance, I opened my laptop and printed the previous 3 months of statements. I highlighted every charge that did not belong to our plan and every cash withdrawal that wore the word temporary like perfume. I stapled them into a stack and wrote the date in the corner. Paper bridges the gap between your memory and your nerve when the morning tries to talk you out of what you know. At dawn, I made coffee and made a decision. I cancelled every card in her name. Not out of rage. Out of respect for the person I would need to be in a week if I kept letting contempt spend my future. I called my bank and removed authorized status. I called the store cards she had opened for discounts and asked that they close the accounts tied to my name. I set new daily limits. I added voice passwords. I separated the bill pay account from the cushion account with a firewall of signatures. I emailed myself the confirmations and labeled the folder with the same word she had used, paycheck. I wanted to remember the exact moment I had stopped agreeing. By noon she had discovered one of the declines. She tried to buy a lunch for her team and messaged me about a glitch. I told her there was no glitch and that I had made a change. I said the joint card would still cover essentials and that anything outside essentials would require the conversation she had avoided by turning me into a function. She sent 3 texts using words that were meant to pull me back into our old script. Controlling. Small. Afraid. I did not defend myself. People can drown each other in adjectives. I stuck to nouns. Rent. Food. Utilities. Safety. When she came home that evening she announced that I had embarrassed her in front of colleagues. She said adults do not lock each other out of accounts. I said adults do not call their spouse a paycheck. She changed the subject to how much I owed her for enabling my career. I asked her to list the line items, and she said the list was obvious to anyone with ambition. I told her I recognized ambition, and that I had simply stopped financing its costumes. That night I moved the ring to my right hand to keep it from knocking against the keyboard while I wrote the rest of my plan. I made 2 columns, if we separate and if we rebuild. Under the first, I listed practical steps, notice period, deposit, furniture division, a quiet agreement that neither of us would turn friends and family into juries. Under the second, I wrote terms that made my stomach settle just reading them. Shared budget in writing, no personal accounts touching the household without permission, counseling with someone who does not confuse theater with therapy, and respect defined by actions, not captions. I wrote my own quiet rule at the bottom of both columns: do not argue at night. I slept, not well, but on purpose. The next week revealed how fast a sentence can harden into a posture. She began leaving early and returning late with the confidence of someone who expected a bailout every time a swipe turned red. She asked for access to her share of the emergency fund to cover a short-term opportunity. I said no and watched the shock move across her face like she had found a stranger sitting in our kitchen. She said I was suffocating her projects. I said projects with oxygen die slower when the investor knows the plan. She said I sounded like a manager. I said managers read receipts. I called my sister, Amelie, because she tells the truth without setting things on fire. I told her exactly what had been said and done. She asked me whether I would be able to live with myself if I let this slide. I said no. She asked whether I would be able to live with myself if I ended it out of pure pride. I said also no. She said then I needed a third option: firm terms, no drama, and a deadline for a decision that would honor both my history and my boundaries. She offered to be present if we had a formal talk, not as a participant but as a quiet witness who kept the timeline correct. I thanked her and said I might take her up on it. The charges tried to find new routes. A new app asked for access to payments and promised frictionless living. Frictionless living is how people slide downhill without noticing. I shut it off. The salon tried my old card again. Declined. A cash withdrawal appeared at a kiosk near a boutique hotel. I transferred the remainder of the joint checking into the bills-only account and left a week's groceries in the original as proof of good faith. Then I sat on the floor and cried the way you cry when you realize the word, "we," has been doing most of its work in your own mouth. 3 days later, I found a letter in the post addressed to me but meant for her. It was from a small lender and referenced a pre-approval based on household income. My name sat in the corner like collateral. I put the letter back in the envelope, sealed it with tape, and took a photo. Evidence is not an obsession. It is a seatbelt. I wrote a neat line in my notebook, attempts to leverage my name without consent. Underneath, I wrote what I would say the next time she told me I was small. I would tell her that small and careful are different animals. I would tell her that careful has carried our rent for 4 years while pride tried to buy curtains for windows we did not own. On Friday night, when she finally asked what I wanted, I told her. I wanted one of 2 futures, separate lives with respect, or a rebuilt marriage governed by terms we both signed and lived. She asked whether love fit anywhere in those sentences. I told her love fits everywhere when respect does, otherwise it just rents space and leaves the dishes in the sink. She said she needed the weekend to think. I nodded and made tea and cleaned the counter until it squeaked. I emailed myself a copy of my 2-column plan and attached the stack of highlighted statements for my own archive. I fell asleep to the hum of the refrigerator and woke to an apartment that felt like a waiting room. The next morning, I canceled the remaining secondary card that I had forgotten. It was the last piece of plastic that could turn my name into her momentum without my consent. As the confirmation email arrived, my phone buzzed with a message from her. She had booked a hotel for 2 nights to clear her head and would return Sunday evening to talk. She told me not to make any big moves while she was gone. I looked at the email on my screen, then at the message, then at the 2 columns on my table. I realized the big move had already happened when I chose dignity over noise. I spent the weekend quietly. I walked without headphones. I cooked pasta and ate it from a deep bowl like medicine. I read a thin book about boundaries that did not insult my intelligence. I prayed in a way that asked not for victory, but for clarity and patience. I folded laundry and put it away like a person practicing control over the small things he could control. In the evening, I wrote a new page for my plan. At the top, I wrote the sentence she had used and the sentence I had answered with. Underneath, I wrote a single promise to myself: I will not be a paycheck to anyone who refuses to see the person who earns it. On Sunday evening, the door opened and closed. She set her bag down and sat at the table as if it had been waiting for us. I placed the 2 columns between us and told her we would choose a path before midnight. She looked at the paper, then at me, and I saw a flicker of the person who had loved my steadiness before her friends decided it was funny. She said she would listen. I told her I would speak first because I needed to hear my voice hold a line. I began with facts. The cards. The charges. The letter from the lender. The sentence that started it. I told her what I would accept if we were to continue: a budget we both sign, counseling with someone we both respect, no personal accounts touching the household without written consent, and a respect clause that meant no more public jokes that turned me into a prop. I told her I would not be her investor. I would be her husband or her ex. I would not be both. She asked for time to respond. I said she had tonight, and that if she needed longer, she could take it in a different apartment with her own cards and her own rent. She stared at the columns like they were an exam and her grade mattered. Then she said she would answer in the morning, after she had slept without a hotel and without an audience. I agreed. We turned off the lights. We lay on our sides of the bed like 2 countries negotiating a border. I breathed, slow and deliberate. My chest felt like a door that had been opened and would not be closed again. In the morning, she said she would try the terms. She spoke softly, like a person who had been shouted at by her own reflection all night. She said she would attend counseling, sign a budget, and keep personal accounts away from the household unless both of us agreed in writing. She added that she would stop using my caution as a punchline. She did not apologize for the sentence about the paycheck. She said she had meant it in anger. Anger is not a translation. It is a megaphone. I nodded anyway, because the point now was not to collect apologies. It was to build scaffolding or to tear down a tent and walk away. We chose scaffolding. It was not a romantic choice. It was a disciplined one. We sat at the table and wrote a budget that did not insult reality. We divided expenses by actual income, not by dreams. We set a modest discretionary line for each of us, the kind that bought coffee without permission and nothing else. We wrote a line at the bottom: any purchase above a set amount required a conversation and a yes from both. We both initialed it. I put the paper in a transparent sleeve and taped a copy inside a cupboard door where we could not pretend we had forgotten. Counseling began 2 days later. The therapist did not treat our marriage like a show. She asked for definitions: respect in actions, trust in processes, love in verbs. I said respect looked like no ambushes, financial or emotional. She said respect looked like recognition of her effort, even when my spreadsheets scared her. The therapist nodded and said both were valid, then said something that stayed with me: stability is not the enemy of joy, it is the platform that allows it. We left the office and sat on a bench in quiet traffic and didn't speak for 5 minutes. Sometimes silence is the first sentence that sounds honest. The first month was a ledger of small attempts. She brought home receipts and placed them on the tray by the keys. I did not circle items with a pen. I scanned them into a shared folder and wrote "OK" in the notes field. She stopped telling stories in public that made me sound like an accountant with no pulse. I stopped making jokes in private that made her work sound like play. She started cooking on Wednesdays. I started turning off my mental calculator during the first 5 minutes of any plan. We were clumsy and careful. We were not sweet. We were competent. Competence has saved more marriages than poetry ever will. The second month revealed cracks. She missed the counseling session twice with last-minute work emergencies that sounded like reruns. I told her I could not rebuild alone. She said she knew and booked the next 4 sessions in advance. She stuck to them. I reminded myself not to treat compliance as romance. It was simply proof of effort. Proof mattered because I had chosen to live with evidence, not hope. Julian's shadow hung in the doorway of our weeks even though he had vanished from our phones and calendars. I had sent him a single line the day after we chose scaffolding: no contact in any form, documented if attempted. He never attempted. We learned which mutual friends needed to stay in our past by the way they craved the story more than they respected the silence. People who use your pain as entertainment are cheaper than any boutique bill. I paid them in distance. Around month 3, my wife asked to take a short trip with her team. She presented the plan like a grown adult: dates, hotel, program, the name of the supervisor leading it. She offered to share the invoice and to cover her discretionary costs from her own line. I felt my chest tighten, not because the numbers were wrong, but because memory does not care about math. I told her the truth in a sentence: I felt uneasy and would likely feel uneasy for a long time. She said she understood and would send the calendar invite and a photo of the airport board when she arrived. She did, and then she sent nothing else. When she came back, she placed a stack of receipts on the tray and sat at the table without asking for praise. She simply acted like a citizen of a house with rules. We started our own weekly check-in, 10 minutes on Sunday evenings with no phones, 3 lines each, 1 fact, 1 feeling, 1 appreciation. It sounded silly the first time. It felt like oxygen by the 4th. I learned she hated how her colleagues measured worth by weekend spend. She learned I feared becoming invisible unless I was paying. We both learned to notice something ordinary and say it out loud. She began to thank me for the invisible work of stability. I began to thank her for the visible work of warmth. 2 quiet professionals learning to be amateurs in gratitude. Then came the test I did not plan for. Her company cut her hours during a contraction. Her discretionary line vanished for 2 months overnight, and the budget we had written together suddenly mattered more than our pride. She cried at the table, not loudly, but like someone who felt the scaffolding groan. I put a hand near hers on the wood and told her what I believed. This had nothing to do with her worth and everything to do with a market that treats people like widgets. She nodded and looked at the paper on the inside of the cupboard where our agreement lived and said she would not touch the cushion without asking. She did not. We paid our bills on time. We ate more at home. We both slept. Some mornings I still woke with the old sentence echoing in the room. You'll never be more than a paycheck. On those mornings I made eggs and wrote one line in my notebook that proved the sentence wrong. I wrote about a neighbor I had helped move a couch without being asked. I wrote about a report at work that I cleaned up for a colleague who had run out of time. I wrote about calling my mother on a Tuesday. The list was private and unheroic. It reminded me that identity cannot be reduced to an invoice number. At the end of the 4th month, the therapist asked us to consider whether we were rebuilding or simply co-managing a ceasefire. I stared at the bookshelf and understood what I had been avoiding. I told the truth, I did not know if love had returned. I knew respect had, in small pieces. My wife said she had fallen into a hole that attention had dug, and that climbing out took longer than jumping in. The therapist said the next stage would either be an honest exit or a deeper practice. Both required the same thing, no contempt. We chose the deeper practice for 1 more quarter with a condition we did not write down but honored like law: any relapse into contempt would end it without speeches. We added one activity to our week that did not cost much and still felt like building something. We volunteered on Saturday mornings at a community kitchen. She handled the front room with her social ease. I handled the back with my systems brain. We came home smelling like onions and found ourselves less inclined to audition for status. Service is a disinfectant when pride has left handprints everywhere. In month 6, the bank sent an email offering a pre-approved card to reward your lifestyle. I clicked delete and laughed out loud in the kitchen. She heard me and asked what was funny. I told her the punchline, and she laughed too, the unclenched kind. We both understood the joke. The old version of us would have accepted the offer as proof of arrival. The current version of us wanted fewer ways to turn tomorrow into an apology. We had setbacks. One evening, she came home excited about a potential freelancer project and asked for a small advance from the cushion to buy materials. My stomach clenched. The old feelings lined up to audition. I told them to sit down. Then I asked her to show me the plan. She had one. We funded half from the discretionary category spread over 2 months and half from a tiny extra I had earned at work. She delivered the project on time and paid the cushion back. We both slept with a relief that has nothing to do with romance and everything to do with not being afraid of your own house. 9 months after the night I cancelled every card in her name, we sat at the table and took the page down from the cupboard. We retired one clause and strengthened another. We retired the proof of receipts ritual because it had done its job and now felt like a hobby for fear. We strengthened the respect clause by making it more specific: no demeaning jokes in public, no weaponized comparisons in private. We both signed the revised version and returned the paper to its sleeve. We did not frame it. We did not need a shrine. We needed a habit. What about love? People ask in whispers when they think it's safe. The truth is simple and not cinematic. Love came back in pieces. It came back in the way she looked at me when I fixed a leaking tap without being asked, not with awe, but with recognition. It came back in the way I looked at her when she closed her laptop at 8 without being prompted by a fight. It came back in the way we reached for each other's hands at a bus stop because the wind had turned and the city felt colder than it should. It did not arrive to applause. It arrived like a neighbor who knocks and brings soup. There is another truth I keep in reserve for the nights when doubt tells me I am naive. The cancellation of those cards was not a punishment. It was a boundary. It protected both of us from a style of living that would have devoured everything decent in the room. If we last, it will be because that boundary stayed in place even when our hearts softened. If we don't, the end will be clean because the terms will already be written, and no one will have to pretend they forgot the order of events. I still carry the 2-column page in my desk. Sometimes I touch the edge to remind myself that options exist. Knowing you can leave makes staying honest. Knowing you can stay makes leaving calm. Either way, the person I have to live with is me, and he needs to be able to read his own notes without shame. If someone asks for advice after hearing my story, I offer this: do not argue with contempt. Do not finance it either. Put the facts on paper. Close the doors that turn your name into someone else's momentum. Open the doors that let respect back in, even if it looks boring. Choose one action each day that your future self will thank you for: cancel a card, cook at home, show a receipt, hold a silence, attend the counseling session, apologize without turning the apology into a speech. And write one line a day that proves you are a person, not a paycheck. Over time, those lines add up to a life no sentence can reduce. My wife once called me a paycheck. I answered with a boundary and a plan. The boundary held. The plan carried us across a difficult season. We are still walking. Some days we are side by side. Some days there is space between us while we catch our breath. Either way, I am not financing contempt anymore. I am investing in a house where respect pays the rent on time, love cooks on weeknights, and dignity keeps the books. That is the only ledger I want my name on. That is the ending I can live with, and the beginning I choose again every morning when I make coffee and open the cupboard and see the paper that says we meant it.
Follow me for more stories.